On the morning of September 2nd, 1665, Thomas Vincent stood at the edge of a freshly dug trench in the churchyard of St. Olav Hart Street, watching gravediggers measure the depth with a knotted rope. 6 feet. Exactly 6 feet. 32 years old, parish clerk for 9 years. Keeper of the burial records. The plague had killed 7,165 Londoners that week alone. The churchyard that had served 340 parishioners for 2 centuries now received 40 bodies every day. Vincent held a leather-bound ledger under his arm, pages filled with names, dates, and a new column he'd added 3 weeks earlier. Depth of interment. Every parish in London was burying its dead. But they weren't burying them the same way. The practice had no central authority, no royal decree, no medical consensus. Each of London's 109 parishes operated independently, guided by local custom, available space, geological conditions, and the judgment of men like Vincent, who suddenly found themselves managing mass death with medieval infrastructure. St. Olav's had decided on 6 feet after the vestry met on August 12th and debated for 3 hours. St. Botolph Aldgate, 2 streets east, buried at 4 feet. St. Catherine Cree used 5 feet for plague victims, 3 feet for natural deaths. St. Dunstan in the east had abandoned individual graves entirely and dug communal pits reaching 12 feet down. The variation wasn't arbitrary. It reflected 109 separate calculations of soil composition, water table depth, available labor, theological interpretation, and raw desperation. Vincent's parish sat on London clay, dense blue-gray sediment that held its shape when wet, crumbled when dry. The gravediggers, 4 men working in rotating shifts, paid 3 shillings per day, plus hazard compensation of 1 shilling, could excavate clay with reasonable efficiency down to 7 feet. Below that depth, groundwater seeped through fissures in the clay layer, flooding the grave bottom within hours. St. Olav's had learned this in July when they attempted an 8-foot burial for a merchant's family. The coffins floated. The gravediggers had to weight them with stones, then backfill rapidly before the entire trench collapsed. 6 feet became the standard depth, deep enough to contain the miasma, the poisonous air that contemporary medical theory held responsible for plague transmission, shallow enough to dig efficiently with depleted labor forces, practical enough to prevent groundwater contamination of the parish wells. But walk half a mile north to St. Giles Cripplegate, and the mathematics changed completely. St. Giles sat on gravel deposits left by ancient Thames tributaries, permeable sediment that drained rapidly and never held standing water. The parish sexton, William Ramsay, had ordered graves dug to 8 feet throughout August. The gravel allowed it. The sexton's theological interpretation demanded it. Ramsay believed plague victims carried corrupted humors that required deeper burial to prevent resurrection complications. He'd studied in Leiden, absorbed continental theories about bodily decay, and returned to London convinced that insufficient burial depth violated both medical prudence and scriptural injunction. The parish paid for his conviction. 8-foot graves in gravel required twice the excavation time of 6-foot graves in clay. St. Giles employed 7 gravediggers working dawn to dusk, 6 days per week. The parish rate, the local tax-funding church operations, increased 40% in September to cover labor costs. Parishioners complained. Ramsay refused to compromise. The dead of St. Giles Cripplegate went down 8 feet. Meanwhile, 3 miles east in Stepney, the parish faced different constraints entirely. Stepney's churchyard occupied low-lying ground near the Thames, prone to flooding during high tides. The water table sat 18 inches below surface level in dry months, reached ground level during wet weather. Digging 6 feet meant excavating through standing water for the bottom 4 feet of every grave. The parish had tried it in early August. Grave diggers stood waist-deep in turbid water, shoveling mud that slumped back into the pit as fast as they removed it. Coffins submerged completely, requiring ropes and pulleys to lower into position. The practice lasted 1 week before the vestry acknowledged reality. Stepney switched to shallow burial, 3 feet maximum, sometimes less. The decision provoked immediate controversy. Neighboring parishes accused Stepney of creating a plague reservoir. Medical treatises recommended minimum burial depth of 4 feet. Time equals 350 milliseconds to prevent miasmatic vapors from escaping. Stepney's shallow graves violated that principle hourly. The parish sexton, James Hickey's, defended the practice with grim pragmatism. Better shallow burial than no burial at all. Better controlled interment in consecrated ground than bodies left to rot in alleyways and cellars. Stepney was receiving 60 dead per day by late August. The churchyard measured 120 feet by 80 feet. The parish had no choice. They buried in layers. 3 feet down, place the coffin, 18 inches of soil on top. Wait 3 days. Dig 3 feet again in the same location. Place another coffin. The dead of Stepney stacked vertically. Time equals 350 milliseconds greater than slash separated by thin barriers of waterlogged earth. The practice horrified observers from parishes with deeper burial customs. It violated English sensibilities about individual grave dignity. But it worked. Stepney buried 1,680 plague victims between August and November without running out of space. The shallow graves, combined with the high water table, created anaerobic conditions that actually slowed decay. Bodies interred in Stepney's waterlogged soil decomposed more slowly than bodies buried 6 feet deep in St. Olave's well-drained clay. The irony escaped no one. The theologically questionable shallow graves functioned better. Time equals 300 milliseconds greater than the medically approved deep graves. Other parishes developed their own solutions based on local geology and theology. St. Mary Woolnoth, built on Roman foundations, couldn't dig below 4 feet without hitting ancient masonry. The parish purchased the adjacent property, a cooper's workshop, demolished the building, and extended the churchyard. They buried at 4 feet in new ground, saved the old churchyard for future emergencies. St. Andrew Holborn discovered limestone bedrock at 5 feet. Gravediggers broke through with iron bars and sledgehammers, but progress slowed to 6 graves per day instead of the usual 20. The parish hired additional workers. Time equals 300 milliseconds, increased wages to 4 shillings daily, and maintained 5-foot depth through sheer labor expenditure. St. Bride Fleet Street encountered a buried river. The Fleet, which flowed above ground north of the city, ran beneath Fleet Street in a brick culvert. Digging 6 feet meant puncturing the culvert roof, flooding the grave with river water contaminated by upstream tanneries and slaughterhouses. St. Bride's switched to 5 feet 3 inches, precisely calculated to stop 9 inches above the culvert. Each parish kept records. Burial registers recorded names, dates, and increasingly, depths. The records reveal patterns invisible to contemporary observers. Wealthier parishes buried deeper. St. Martin in the Fields, serving aristocratic Westminster, maintained 7-foot graves throughout the plague year. The parish employed 12 grave diggers, paid premium wages, and owned excavation equipment including a horse-powered winch for removing soil. Depth signaled status. Shallow burial marked poverty, desperation, or theological deviance. Poorer parishes buried shallower by necessity. St. Botolph Aldgate, serving London's eastern workers and transient population, couldn't afford excavation beyond 4 feet. The parish rate brought in £180 annually. Plague burials cost £620 between June and December. The parish ran a deficit, borrowed from neighboring vestries, and cut every possible expense, including grave depth. Geography correlated with burial practice. Parishes near the Thames. Stepney, Rotherhithe, St. Saviour Southwark, all used shallow burial constrained by water tables. Parishes on London's elevated western edge, St. Giles in the Fields, St. Martin in the Fields, buried deeper, working well-drained soil on higher ground. Clay soil parishes clustered around 6 feet. Gravel soil parishes varied from 5 to 8 feet, depending on theological interpretation and financial resources. The variation created unexpected consequences. In October 1665, heavy rains flooded London for 6 consecutive days. The Thames rose 4 feet above normal level. Groundwater tables surged. Parishes that had buried at shallow depth experienced coffin displacement. St. Botolph Aldgate reported 12 coffins pushed to surface level by rising water. Stepney lost count. The parish hired workers to rebury displaced coffins, but rain continued, water rose, and coffins kept surfacing. The parish gave up. They placed stones on exposed coffins, covered them with soil, and waited for the water to recede. Meanwhile, deeper burying parishes faced different problems. St. Giles Cripplegate's 8-foot graves, filled with water despite the permeable gravel. Gravediggers pumped water out with hand-operated lift pumps. Buried coffins backfilled rapidly. The effort required 2 additional hours per grave. The parish fell behind schedule. Bodies waited in parish storage for 3, then 4, then 5 days before burial. The sexton refused to reduce burial depth. The parish paid the cost in delayed interments. St. Olavo Hart Street, with its 6-foot standard in clay soil, experienced intermediate problems. Some graves flooded. Most didn't. The clay held water out when compacted properly, let water seep in when excavated carelessly. Grave quality depended on gravedigger skill and attention under pressure. Thomas Vincent inspected every grave before burial, rejected those that showed water seepage, demanded re-excavation. The practice slowed operations but prevented coffin floating. By November, patterns had emerged. Shallow burial worked in waterlogged conditions. Deep burial worked in well-drained soil with adequate labor. Medium depth, 5 to 6 feet, represented compromise, achievable in varied conditions with moderate effort. But no consensus developed across London. Each parish continued its local practice, justified by local conditions, theology, and custom, the Great Fire of Vieux. September 1666 altered the equation. The fire destroyed 87 parish churches, including their churchyards. Rebuilding offered opportunity to standardize burial practices. It didn't happen. Parishes rebuilt churchyards according to pre-fire customs. St. Olave Hart Street, which had escaped the fire, continued 6-foot burial. St. Mary Le Bow, rebuilt by Christopher Wren with a new churchyard, specified 5 feet in the vestry minutes. St. Bride Fleet Street, reconstructed with Wren's famous tiered steeple, maintained its 5-foot 3-inch standard calculated to avoid the Fleet culvert. The lack of standardization reflected English ecclesiastical structure. The Church of England operated through parish vestries, local governing bodies with substantial autonomy. No bishop could order uniform burial depth. No royal proclamation could override parish judgment. London's fragmented religious geography prevented centralized plague response. Each parish assessed its own needs, made its own decisions, and lived with its own consequences. Modern archaeological excavation reveals the physical evidence. Plague pits in Stepney show stacked burials at 2.5 to 3.5 feet depth. Excavations at St. Bride Fleet Street consistently hit burials at 5 feet 3 inches, exactly as parish records specified. St. Giles Cripplegate burials appear at 7.5 to 8 feet, confirming William Ramsay's 8-foot mandate. The archaeology validates the written record and demonstrates that burial depth variation persisted throughout the plague year and beyond. The practice had medical consequences poorly understood at the time. Shallow burial in anaerobic waterlogged soil actually reduced disease transmission by slowing decay and containing putrefaction gases. Deep burial in well-drained aerobic soil accelerated decomposition, but potentially contaminated groundwater. Neither approach affected plague transmission because plague spread through rat fleas, not miasma or buried bodies. But the parishes didn't know that. They made decisions based on medieval medical theory, local geology, available resources, and theological interpretation. The deepest irony, the parishes burying shallowest, accused of creating plague reservoirs through insufficient depth, were operating more safely than parishes burying deeper. Stepney's 3-foot waterlogged graves posed less risk than St. Giles's 8-foot dry graves. But contemporary observers lacked the knowledge to recognize it. Thomas Vincent survived the plague. He continued as parish clerk at St. Olave Hart Street until his death in 1697. His burial register, preserved in the London Metropolitan Archives, documents 2,347 plague burials between June 1665 and February 1666. The depth column shows consistent 6-foot interments except during the October floods, when 5 graves went to 5 feet 6 inches and 3 to 5 feet even. The records end in 1697 with Vincent's own burial. The register notes, Thomas Vincent, parish clerk, 64 years, died February 18, 1697, buried February 21st, depth 6 feet. The practice of variable burial depth by parish continued into the 18th century, ended not by medical understanding, but by space exhaustion. London's churchyards filled completely. Burial moved to new cemeteries outside city limits, where standardized depth became practical for the first time. The great metropolitan cemeteries, Kensal Green. Time equals 250 milliseconds greater than Highgate, Nunhead, all specified 6 feet as standard depth. Not because 6 feet was medically optimal, but because it had become traditional in London's clay soil parishes. The standard persists. Modern British graves go to 6 feet, a practice originating in medieval custom, refined by plague emergency, and standardized only after geological necessity made variation impractical. The depth carries no medical justification. It reflects the judgment of men like Thomas Vincent, making decisions under pressure with inadequate knowledge but genuine responsibility. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about London's plague year, parish autonomy, and the geological constraints that shaped mortality practices. Real people. Real decisions under impossible pressure. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if your family has connections to Historicus London. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Thomas Vincent and the thousands he buried don't disappear into silence. These parish clerks deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.